The night had barely released its grip on the earth when the first streaks of pale light stretched across the African sky. The air was still, heavy, almost refusing to move, as though the village itself held its breath. Huts stood in their usual quiet rows, their thatched roofs glistening faintly with dew, but behind their walls the people were already awake. No one spoke too loudly, voices carried in hushed tones, whispers trailing like restless spirits through narrow paths of red earth. There was something in the air more pressing than the dawn, something heavier than the mist that clung stubbornly to the ground. Near the heart of the village, where the central clearing opened wide beneath the sky, a crowd began to gather. Some came quickly, walking with a sharpness in their step, eager for the spectacle about to unfold. Others shuffled with hesitation, as if ashamed to be there but unable to resist. Children were pulled by their mothers to the edges, told to stay quiet, their wide eyes filled with curiosity and fear. Men leaned on their spears, their shadows long and distorted in the rising sun. Their faces bore a mixture of anticipation and unease, as though they were hungry for justice yet unsure what it would taste like. At the center of it all stood the council hut, its wooden posts carved with patterns of ancestors, its doorway dark like a mouth waiting to swallow secrets. Thick smoke curled from a clay pot set outside, the scent of burning herbs drifting over the people. It was meant to purify the air, to keep away evil spirits, but the villagers shifted uncomfortably as though the smoke itself reminded them of guilt they carried but dared not confess. The sacred drums leaned against the hut, their skins taut, waiting for the hands that would summon the ancestors. Their silence was almost deafening, for the people knew that once those drums spoke, decisions could not be taken lightly. From the far side of the clearing, 2 guards appeared. Between them walked a young woman, her wrists bound with rope, her steps careful, deliberate, not because she feared falling, but because each step seemed to sink into the weight of 100 accusing eyes. Her name rolled on the tongues of the villagers in low murmurs, each whisper heavier than the last. She did not bow her head in shame though, she kept her chin high, her eyes fixed on the hut where judgment awaited her. Her clothes were simple, the fabric faded from long days of labor, yet she carried herself with a dignity that unsettled the crowd. Old women leaned close together, their voices trembling as they spoke of the stories they had heard. How she was seen walking toward the sacred forest, how she had been meeting with someone who did not belong, how she must have been consorting with powers that no ordinary woman should touch. Young men exchanged smirks, some with contempt, others with nervous excitement, as though her trial was less about truth and more about entertainment. Somewhere in the crowd, her mother clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her lips moving silently in prayer, tears sliding unchecked down her cheeks. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing moment. A baby cried in the distance, its wail cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Dogs barked, unsettled by the tension. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Yet amid the noise of the crowd, a strange silence hovered too, a silence born of fear, the fear that what they were about to witness was bigger than them all. The sun had now risen fully, its light spilling across the clearing, but it did not chase away the shadows clinging to the people's hearts. They were here for judgment, but deep within, many knew they were also here to hide their own insecurities behind the mask of righteousness. As the young woman reached the steps of the council hut, the sacred drums were lifted and placed before the elders. Their skins would soon echo with a sound that decided fates. Every eye in the village turned to her, and though the whispers continued, no one dared raise their voice too high. The morning belonged to judgment, and the anxious silence before it was the heaviest silence of all. Long before she was led to the council's hut, the young woman's days were marked by toil and quiet endurance. She had been born into modest means, her father a hunter who never returned from one of his journeys into the forest. His absence left her mother widowed while she was still a child, and from that moment, life became a constant rhythm of labor. She learned quickly to shoulder responsibilities beyond her years, carrying water in pots balanced on her head, gathering firewood until her hands blistered, and tending to small patches of millet and maize under the merciless sun. Her mother, though weary from loss, never allowed despair to consume her. She raised her daughter with stern discipline wrapped in tenderness, teaching her to weave mats, mend clothes, and cook with patience. Yet it was not the domestic lessons alone that shaped her character, it was the way her mother spoke of dignity. Even if the world spits on you, she would say, do not spit on yourself. Stand tall, my child, because the ground will always try to bend you. Those words lived in the young woman's heart, echoing in her every step. By the time she reached her early 20s, she had become a striking figure in the village, though she never sought admiration. Her frame was lean from endless days in the fields, her arms strong from grinding grain, her skin glowing with the sheen of sweat and resilience. She wore her beauty unknowingly, but others noticed it keenly. Men admired her but whispered doubts about her independence. Women watched her with unease, some admiring her strength but others resenting it, quietly comparing her ability to endure with their own faltering stamina. Her daily routine was simple yet relentless. At dawn, while most villagers still lingered in slumber, she was already awake, pounding grain in a mortar, the rhythm echoing across the compound. By mid-morning she was in the fields, her back bent over rows of crops, her hands moving with practiced precision. She worked not for leisure or wealth but to feed herself and her mother, who could no longer bear the strain of long hours under the sun. When others rested at midday, she often stayed longer, determined to finish before returning home. At night, when the village buzzed with gossip or laughter, she remained indoors, tending to her mother's frail body, massaging her legs with shea oil, whispering words of comfort, feeding her gently as though caring for a child. It was this devotion that set her apart. While others sought companionship, marriage, or escape through festivity, she chose responsibility. But responsibility, though noble, rarely draws admiration. More often it breeds suspicion and envy. Villagers began to whisper that a woman so strong, so tireless, must be hiding something unnatural. How could she, without a husband, without brothers, survive so well? How could her fields yield so much when others struggled? Jealousy twisted into suspicion, suspicion into tales that grew with each telling. The young men, whose advances she politely declined, began to mock her pride in hushed corners. They said she thought herself better than them, too proud to accept a husband. Women, burdened by their own families, whispered that her beauty was a dangerous thing, that perhaps it tempted spirits who granted her unnatural strength. Even the elders, though silent, kept watchful eyes on her, unsettled by her ability to live with dignity in the face of hardship. What no one saw or refused to see was her weariness at night, when she collapsed on her mat after caring for her mother, her body aching, her heart heavy with loneliness. What no one cared to admit was that her harvests were not blessed by magic but by sheer discipline, her strength not born of spirits but of necessity. Yet envy rarely listens to reason. It festers quietly, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite into flames. Though she remained kind, always greeting others with warmth, sharing food when she could, or carrying loads for the elderly, the shadow of resentment followed her like a second skin. Her good deeds, instead of softening hearts, only deepened the whispers. No one is that selfless without reason. She must be hiding something. And so the ground beneath her feet was laid with seeds of suspicion, ready to grow into accusations that would one day drag her before the council. It began quietly, like a faint ripple on the surface of a still river. At first, no one paid attention when the young woman lingered near the forest's edge at dusk. She often carried baskets of food wrapped in cloth, her steps purposeful yet discreet. To most it seemed harmless. She could have been gathering herbs, collecting firewood, or leaving offerings to the ancestors as many villagers did. But curiosity is a restless creature, and soon eyes began to follow her. One evening, a boy returning from the river saw her standing beneath the tall irako tree at the border of the sacred forest. The fading light cast her in a strange glow, and beside her, he thought he saw the outline of a figure cloaked in shadow. The boy ran home breathless, and by morning his story had spread like wildfire. The villagers began to whisper that the young woman was not alone in her nightly ventures. She was meeting someone, or something, hidden in the forbidden depths of the trees. The stranger, whoever he was, never appeared within the village boundaries. He was said to wear a hood, his face unseen, his presence unsettling. Some swore they had heard his voice, low, commanding, almost otherworldly. Others insisted he left no footprints on the earth, proof that he was no ordinary man. The more the villagers speculated, the darker their stories became. To some, the mystery figure was a spirit lover, drawn to her beauty and gifting her unnatural strength in exchange for devotion. To others, he was a sorcerer from another land, using her as a vessel for his dark work. The most dangerous rumor of all suggested she had betrayed the village, offering food and secrets to an enemy lurking in the forest. In a land where loyalty to the community was sacred, the idea of betrayal struck a deep and fearful chord. The young woman, unaware of how the stories had twisted, continued her quiet visits. Each evening she carried a small gourd of water, roasted yam, or dried fish wrapped in leaves, and disappeared into the dusk. Those who spied on her swore she exchanged these gifts with the shadowed man, then returned empty-handed, her face calm, her stride steady. No explanation was offered, and none was asked directly, because asking meant stepping too close to whatever power she might have touched. Instead, people watched, muttered, and pulled their children away whenever she passed. The elders were the most disturbed. The forest was not merely a cluster of trees, it was sacred ground, the dwelling of ancestral spirits and the boundary no one crossed without ritual. For her to walk there so often was unsettling enough, but to meet a stranger beneath the Irako tree was unthinkable. They gathered in hushed councils, debating whether to summon her, but fear of the unknown held them back. It was easier to let the rumors spread than to confront what they could not understand. Every whispered tale added fuel to the fire. When crops failed in one corner of the village, tongues wagged that her dealings with the stranger had cursed the fields. When a child fell ill with fever, it was said the spirits she consorted with were displeased. When goats went missing, their bones later found in the bush, people whispered her name as though it explained everything. The tension thickened with each passing day. She remained outwardly calm, her routine unchanged, but in the shadows of the huts, neighbors watched her with narrowed eyes. Children who once greeted her cheerfully now shrank behind their mothers' skirts. Women stopped borrowing salt or firewood from her home. Men who once sought her hand in marriage now spoke of her with contempt, their rejected pride transforming into fuel for gossip. One night, as the moon rose full and pale, a group of villagers gathered outside the council hut. They spoke in urgent tones, pointing toward the forest. "She goes there again and again," one said. "No woman does such a thing without reason." Another shook his head gravely. "It is not reason, it is witchcraft." The eldest among them struck his staff against the earth. "The ancestors will not forgive us if we remain silent. She must be questioned. She must explain herself." And so the stage was set. Suspicion had grown into certainty, and whispers into demands. The mysterious stranger remained unseen, yet his shadow fell across the entire village, darkening every thought. The young woman's kindness and strength, once a source of quiet admiration, now became twisted proof of sorcery. In the stillness of the nights, as she carried food to the forest, she had no idea that every step she took was feeding the fire of resentment that would soon consume her. The day of betrayal did not come with thunder or storm. It arrived with the ordinary rhythm of life, disguising its cruelty beneath the calm of morning. The young woman rose before the sun as she always did, grinding grain for the day's meal while her mother dozed beside the hearth. Smoke curled from their small cooking fire, the smell of millet porridge filling the hut. She hummed softly, her voice low, unaware that outside the world had already turned against her. It began with her cousin, a woman she had grown up beside, someone who had once shared laughter and secrets with her as children. Envy, however, had long simmered in the cousin's heart. She had married young, her life tangled with hardship, her body worn by childbirth and labor. Each time she saw the young woman walking tall and unwed, still admired despite her poverty, bitterness tightened its grip. That morning, the cousin stood in the village square with a voice louder than anyone expected. "I have seen her with my own eyes," she declared, her face drawn into a mask of certainty. "She goes to the forest not for firewood, not for herbs, but to meet a stranger. A man cloaked like a spirit, who whispers to her in the dark. I saw her give him food, and I heard her speak words not of this world." Her words struck like a drumbeat, sharp and undeniable in their conviction. The villagers, already swollen with suspicion, seized on them eagerly. The cousin's betrayal gave weight to their whispers, turning rumor into what they believed to be truth. One by one voices rose to add to the tale. "I saw her return one night, her eyes glowing like embers," a man claimed. "My child fell sick after she passed our compound," another insisted. "She must be consorting with spirits. Why else would she reject every man who sought her hand?" someone else spat. The stories twisted into monstrous shapes, each teller exaggerating, each accusation heavier than the last. By midday the clearing was alive with agitation. Villagers gathered in clusters, their faces lit with both fear and excitement. It was no longer just a question of curiosity, it had become a demand for judgment. The council elders, pressed by the growing unrest, could no longer remain silent. The chief elder, a man whose gray hair framed eyes hardened by years of authority, called for her to be summoned. The sacred staff was struck against the earth 3 times, a sound that echoed through the village like the tolling of a bell. Messengers were sent to fetch her, their expressions grim as though already convinced of her guilt. Inside her hut, her mother sensed the change before the messengers arrived. She clutched her daughter's arm, her voice trembling. "Do not go, my child. They are blind with fear. They will not listen." But the young woman placed her hand gently over her mother's and shook her head. I have nothing to hide. Let them hear me. Truth does not bow to lies. When the messengers entered, she stood tall, though her heart pounded beneath her ribs. Her mother clung to her, pleading with the men to reconsider, but they pulled the old woman aside. This is not your matter, one said coldly. She must answer before the council. Her mother's wails followed as they led her away, echoing through the compound like the cry of a bird whose nest had been torn apart. The village square was already crowded when she arrived. Faces turned sharply toward her, some twisted with anger, others with morbid curiosity. She searched for kindness among them but found only suspicion and hard glares. Her cousin stood near the front, eyes averted, yet her mouth curved with the faintest satisfaction. Betrayal stood there in plain sight, clothed in family blood. The council elders sat in a semicircle before the hut, their carved staffs planted firmly in the ground. Behind them, the sacred drums rested, waiting to be struck. The chief elder gestured, and the crowd parted as she was brought forward. They forced her to her knees in the dirt, her hands bound, dust rising around her like a cloud of shame. People of the village, the elder intoned, his voice carrying over the restless crowd, we are gathered here because grave accusations have been made. This woman stands accused of consorting with spirits, of betraying the laws of our ancestors. The testimony of her own kin condemns her. We must now decide her fate. At his words, the villagers erupted into shouts. Some cried for her to be banished, others demanded harsher punishment. She has cursed our land. She brings shame upon us. Let her pay. Their chants rose like a storm, feeding on themselves, until it seemed the very earth shook with their voices. Her mother, who had followed despite the guards' protests, pushed her way into the crowd. She fell to her knees beside her daughter, clutching her tightly. No. She is innocent, she cried, her voice hoarse with desperation. She has cared for me, she has labored for this village. Do not condemn her for lies. But her words were drowned in the uproar. One of the elders raised his hand for silence, but the crowd ignored him, their fury spilling over like floodwaters. A guard stepped forward and pulled the mother away roughly, silencing her cries with force. The young woman's eyes followed her mother as she was dragged back, but she did not weep. She lifted her chin, refusing to bend beneath their hatred. The drums had not yet been struck, but the people already believed the verdict was clear. In their hearts, fear had found an enemy, and envy had dressed it in her name. The day of betrayal had reached its climax, and though she knelt before them bound and accused, the strength in her gaze unsettled even those most eager to see her fall. The council hut loomed at the edge of the square, a structure more than wood and thatch. It was a place where destinies were rewritten, where lives were measured against tradition and judged by the weight of ancestral law. Its posts were thick tree trunks, each carved with faces of spirits and ancestors, their hollow eyes staring down at all who entered. Masks of warriors and hunters, painted in red and black, hung from the beams like silent watchers. The air inside was dense with smoke from burning herbs and resin, the fragrance sharp, almost suffocating, meant to summon protection and truth. Shadows flickered along the walls where firelight danced, making the carved figures seem alive, as if the ancestors themselves leaned closer to witness what was about to unfold. She was dragged toward this place, her wrists bound, her bare feet scraping against the packed earth. The villagers followed like a tide, their voices still murmuring, their anger simmering beneath the hush of ritual. At the doorway, 2 guards pushed her forward, and the weight of the hut swallowed her whole. The noise of the outside world dimmed, replaced by the low hum of chanting from the elders. They forced her to kneel before the council, the hard ground biting into her knees. Her hands were tied before her, the rope coarse against her skin. Above her, the elders sat in a half-circle, their staffs resting across their laps, their faces painted with solemnity. Each man carried years of authority, yet in their eyes lingered something more: fear, suspicion, perhaps even doubt. At the center sat the chief elder, his staff taller than the rest, its top carved into the likeness of a lion's head. The silence did not last. From behind her, voices erupted again, accusations flung like stones. She consorts with spirits, one villager cried. She feeds the stranger of the forest, another shouted. She has cursed our crops and our children. The noise swelled, each claim more vicious than the last, until the hut itself seemed to shake with the force of it. The guards struck their spears against the ground to demand quiet, and slowly the voices dwindled, though the anger in them did not fade. The chief elder's voice filled the space, deep and deliberate. Daughter of this village, you stand accused of betraying the laws of our ancestors. You are said to meet with a stranger in the sacred forest. You are said to bring him food, to speak with him in secret. Some claim he is a spirit. Some claim he is an enemy. Do you deny this?" The woman lifted her gaze, her eyes steady, her lips pressed firmly together. She did not speak. Silence spread through the hut like a challenge. The elders shifted uneasily. Some saw arrogance in her refusal to answer. Others saw courage, the kind that made them question whether she was guilty at all. One of the harsher elders leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Her silence is proof enough. A woman who hides her tongue hides her sins. Why should we waste more time? She has broken the covenant with our ancestors, she must be punished." Another, younger elder shook his head. "Do not be so hasty. We have seen only shadows and heard only rumors. None have brought us proof, only fear. Should we condemn her on whispers alone?" The debate began, voices rising and falling like waves. Some elders argued fiercely, insisting she had endangered the entire village by stepping into the sacred forest, a boundary none should cross without ritual. They spoke of curses, of spirits angered by her actions, of crops that withered and children who fell sick. Others, though fewer, urged caution. They pointed out her years of labor, her devotion to her mother, her lack of selfishness. "Would a woman so committed to her family betray her people?" one asked. All the while, she remained silent, her back straight despite the weight of the ropes binding her. Her eyes met each elder's gaze in turn, unflinching, as though daring them to see the truth not in her words but in her spirit. Her silence unnerved them. It was not the silence of guilt but of defiance, the kind that carried dignity even in chains. The air grew thicker as the incense burned lower. The smoke coiled upward, blurring the faces of the ancestors carved into the wood. To some, the carvings seemed to frown. To others, they seemed to watch with pity. Outside, the murmurs of the villagers continued, pressing like a storm against the hut's walls. The chief elder raised his hand and quiet returned. His face was grave, unreadable, as he looked upon the kneeling woman. "This is no small matter. If she is guilty, the wrath of the ancestors will fall upon us all. If she is innocent and we condemn her wrongly, we will bring shame upon ourselves." His words hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. But still the young woman did not speak. She kept her head high, her silence her only defense, her courage her only weapon. In the midst of fire and fear, she became a figure of unyielding strength, and though the council debated her fate with harsh words and doubtful hearts, none could escape the feeling that something greater hovered over them, waiting to intervene. The moment came when debate could no longer hold back the tide. The villagers outside had grown impatient, their voices rising in waves that seeped through the hut's walls. The elders exchanged glances, and with a solemn nod from the chief, the order was given. The sacred drums were brought forward. 2 men lifted them from their resting place, their polished wooden bodies gleaming in the dim light of the hut. The skins stretched across their frames seemed to shimmer, alive with an energy that belonged not to man but to the ancestors. When the drummers took their places and raised their hands, the crowd outside fell into an uneasy hush, as though they too understood that the sound about to rise would not belong to mortals alone. The first strike thundered through the air, deep and resonant, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The second followed, then a steady rhythm, low and commanding. Each beat summoned the spirits of those who had walked before, calling them to witness the trial of one of their daughters. The hut trembled with the sound, and the clearing outside seemed to pulse with it, a force that neither man nor woman could resist. Children pressed against their mothers, some weeping at the sound that rattled their bones. Old men bowed their heads, lips moving in whispered prayers, while the younger ones clenched their fists, their anger feeding on the rhythm. The women swayed unconsciously, their faces stern, caught between fear and righteousness. The air thickened as the drums rolled on, heavy with expectation. Inside the hut, the elders sat straighter, their eyes glazed with the weight of tradition. This was not just judgment by men, it was the voice of the ancestors deciding through ritual. The chief elder raised his staff and struck the ground in time with the beat, his voice booming over the rhythm. "Let truth be revealed. Let the ancestors guide our hands." The crowd answered with a roar, demanding justice. "She is guilty. Punish her." Their cries rose higher, mingling with the drums until the sound became overwhelming, a storm of human fury and divine authority. The woman knelt in the center of it all, her body still, her eyes unblinking. The council began to murmur among themselves, leaning close, their voices low but urgent. "There is no denying the stories," one elder insisted. "Her cousin has spoken. The people have seen her. The forest does not lie. Another countered, his brow furrowed. But we have no proof, only fear. Will we condemn her because the people cry louder than reason? Yet the tide of opinion leaned heavily toward condemnation. The drums pounded harder, drowning hesitation. Sweat beaded on foreheads, and the smell of incense mixed with fear. The chief elder's hand hovered over his staff, ready to declare her fate. Amid the thunder, the young woman bowed her head. For the first time since she had been dragged there, her lips moved though no sound escaped them. She prayed, silently but with all the strength of her soul. She prayed to the ancestors who were being summoned, to the spirits of the forest, to the God who saw beyond lies. Her heart cried out for truth, not for herself alone, but for the village that had blinded itself with envy and fear. Her prayer was not for mercy but for revelation. If she was to be condemned, let it be with truth laid bare. If she was to rise, let it be not by her strength but by the voice of the unseen. The rhythm of the drums wrapped around her like chains and wings at once, binding her body yet lifting her spirit. Outside, a child's cry pierced the air, sharp and trembling. Inside, the whisper of the elders grew louder, preparing to seal her fate. The chief elder's staff lifted high, his voice ready to thunder the sentence that would brand her forever. And still she prayed, her silence more powerful than the noise, her faith stronger than the ropes that bound her. The drums rolled on, as though the ancestors themselves leaned closer, waiting for the moment when truth could no longer be hidden. The chief elder's staff hovered in the air, ready to strike the ground and declare her guilty. The sacred drums pounded, their thunder a heartbeat that echoed through every chest, driving the people toward the fever of judgment. And then, suddenly, it came. A voice. It rose not from the crowd, nor from within the hut, but from beyond, from the shadowed depths of the sacred forest itself. At first it was like a distant rumble, an echo caught between trees, but as it grew, it carried the weight of command that no human tongue could deny. Stop. The word cut through the air like a blade. The drummers froze, their hands suspended above the skins as though bound by invisible chains. The last note they struck seemed to hang forever, then faded into silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. The entire village stood still, their breath trapped in their throats. Do not condemn the innocent, the voice boomed, rolling over them in waves. Men dropped to their knees, children clung to their mothers, and the elders glanced at one another with terror in their eyes. For a moment none could speak. The young woman lifted her head, her eyes wide, not with fear but with wonder. Her silent prayer still lingered on her lips, and now, as if in answer, the unseen voice spoke truths that only the ancestors or a power greater than man could reveal. You accuse her of walking with spirits, the voice thundered, but you blind yourselves with envy. The man you call a stranger is no ghost, no demon, no lover of darkness. He is a messenger, sent by the king himself, charged to watch and listen, to see whether this village holds honor or treachery. Gasps erupted from the villagers. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads violently in denial. A few staggered backward, their legs trembling. To suggest that the king's hand was in this matter was enough to shake the very foundation of their judgment. The voice did not relent. And what of the tongues that wagged against her? What of those who spread lies to cover their own jealousy? Do you not see? It is not she who betrays, but those who seek her fall. They feared her strength, her beauty, her kindness, and so they cast shadows over her name. But the truth cannot remain hidden in the soil. It rises like the sun and exposes all. The accused cousin, who had been the loudest voice against her, let out a strangled cry. His knees buckled and he collapsed in the dirt, trembling as though struck by lightning. Whispers surged through the crowd. He is the liar. He betrayed her. The spirits know the truth. Mothers pressed their children closer, and even the boldest men avoided each other's eyes. The council sat frozen. The chief elder's staff wavered in his hand. Never before had a voice spoken from the forest at such a moment. Was this the work of the ancestors themselves, or of some divine power greater still? Their authority, so absolute moments ago, now felt fragile in the face of such revelation. The young woman's mother, who had been silenced earlier, let out a sob that cracked the silence. Her frail body shook as she whispered, the truth has come." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she reached toward her daughter, though guards still kept her back. The crowd could not contain its fear. Some fell to the ground, pressing their foreheads to the earth in submission to the unseen power. Others fled a few steps before stopping, unwilling to turn their backs on the forest. The air itself seemed charged, the trees at the edge of the clearing swaying though no wind stirred. The voice thundered one last time, firm and final, Do not lay hands upon her, lest the curse of false judgment fall upon this village. Remember this day, for the eyes of truth are always watching. And then silence. The drums, once so loud, remained mute. No drummer dared lift a hand. No elder dared speak. The entire village hung in the grip of that echo, every heart pounding with the knowledge that something far greater than themselves had spoken. The young woman knelt still, her eyes glistening with tears, not of fear but of release. For the first time, her chains no longer felt like a prison but a symbol of what she had endured. And around her, the village trembled, uncertain of what would come next. The silence after the echoing voice lingered like mist, thick and heavy. No one moved, no one dared to breathe too loudly. And then, from the shadow of the sacred forest, movement stirred. All eyes turned toward the trees, their branches swaying as though bowing to a presence about to emerge. A hooded figure stepped into the clearing. His cloak was long and dark, its edges carrying the dust of many roads. The villagers shrank back, some whispering prayers, others clinging to one another. Slowly, steadily he walked forward, his steps unhurried but filled with purpose. The council square seemed to open for him, a path carved by awe and fear. When he reached the center he paused, lifting his head at last. With deliberate calm he pushed back the hood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. His face was not that of a ghost or spirit but of a man, stern, noble, and unmistakably marked with the insignia of authority. The amulet around his neck bore the emblem of the king, glinting faintly in the firelight. "I am no phantom," he declared, his voice clear and resonant. "I am no spirit of the dead. I am an envoy of the king, sent to walk among you unseen, to witness the ways of this village and report its heart back to the throne." The word struck like thunder. The villagers fell to their knees, their heads bowed. Some elders exchanged glances, their pride dissolving into unease. For all their wisdom, they had nearly condemned one of their own before the eyes of a royal messenger. The envoy turned, his gaze falling upon the young woman still kneeling before the council. His eyes softened, and with a voice less stern, he spoke again. "She is innocent. She saw me on the night when hunger and weariness overcame me at the edge of your forest. Where others passed me by in fear or suspicion, she alone brought food. Not once but many times. She offered kindness when she believed no one watched. She did not do so for favor nor for gain. She did it because her heart is pure." Murmurs rose among the villagers. The accusations they had hurled so fiercely now echoed back at them, hollow and shameful. Faces flushed with guilt, and those who had shouted the loudest lowered their eyes to the ground. The envoy's words carried on, steady as a judgment far greater than theirs. "You turned her generosity into suspicion. You clothed her love for her mother and her strength in labor with envy. And when jealousy festered, you sought to destroy her. But truth does not die at the edge of lies. It stands even when beaten down." The young woman's mother sobbed again, this time with relief. The guards who held the woman released their grip, stepping back as if burned. She rose slowly from her knees, her dignity unbroken, though her body trembled. For a moment, her eyes met the envoy's, and she understood that her suffering had not been in vain. The council sat in silence, the weight of shame heavy upon them. They had been moments away from condemning innocence, and now the entire village watched them with new eyes. The envoy faced the crowd once more, his voice firm. "Let this day be remembered. The king will hear of it, not only of the lies spoken against this woman but of her mercy, which outshines the cruelty of envy. She is guiltless, and her name must never again be dragged through the mud of falsehood." The people bowed, some in shame, some in awe. None dared to protest. The truth had been laid bare, and with it, the innocence of the woman they had nearly destroyed. The council square, which only moments earlier had pulsed with anger and judgment, now lay drenched in silence. The envoy's words still rang in every ear, each syllable pressing down on hearts already heavy with guilt. The villagers avoided one another's eyes, ashamed of the frenzy they had allowed themselves to be swept into. Mothers who had shouted accusations clutched their children close, whispering prayers for forgiveness. Men who had demanded punishment now stood with their heads bowed, unable to meet the gaze of the young woman they had wronged. The cousin who had betrayed her most openly tried to shrink into the crowd, but there was no hiding. The villagers turned on him with eyes that burned with both fury and disappointment. A man stepped forward and yanked him by the arm, dragging him into the square. His protest died in his throat when faced with the envoy's piercing stare. "This one," the envoy said, "is the root of the lie. His words planted poison in your ears. He clothed envy as truth and nearly destroyed an innocent soul. Let him face what he intended for her." The people shouted in agreement. The cousin fell to his knees, trembling, his face pale with fear. Some demanded he be banished, others called for him to be stripped of honor. In the end, the council, its pride broken and its authority humbled, declared that he should be publicly shamed. His name was called out before all, his betrayal spoken aloud so that no one would forget. Stripped of respect, he was led away under jeers, no longer the trusted voice he once pretended to be. As this judgment unfolded, the young woman's mother rushed forward, her frail body stronger than it had seemed moments ago. She fell into her daughter's arms, sobbing with both relief and sorrow. My child, she cried, holding her tightly as though afraid she might vanish again. The young woman clung to her mother, tears streaming freely now that the weight had lifted. For the first time in many days she allowed herself to feel safe. The villagers watched, their shame deepening as they saw the bond between mother and daughter, a bond they had nearly torn apart with their cruelty. Some began to weep quietly, while others murmured apologies that carried little weight against the wounds already inflicted. The council, once so stern and proud, now sat hunched in their seats, unable to lift their eyes. The chief elder placed his staff across his lap, a sign of defeat. He finally spoke, his voice trembling. We have failed. We claimed to carry the wisdom of our fathers, yet we allowed envy and fear to cloud our sight. We bowed to the shouts of the crowd rather than the whispers of truth. Today we are humbled before the ancestors and before this woman we wronged. The other elders murmured in agreement, their heads low. The power they once wielded so easily now felt like a burden. They had been exposed, not only in their error but in their weakness to be swayed by voices louder than reason. The envoy nodded, satisfied with their confession. The king will know of this failure, he said. But he will also know that truth rose before blood was spilled. Learn from this or face a harsher judgment than mine. The people bowed their heads as the envoy's words settled upon them. The shame in the air was thick, but within it also lingered the seed of change. In the center of it all, the young woman stood with her mother's arms wrapped around her, her dignity unbroken, her innocence shining brighter than ever. The night had nearly consumed her, but the dawn promised to rise on a village forever marked by the lesson of truth revealed. The village never forgot the night when the voice rose from the forest. For many, it became a wound of shame, but for all, it became a lesson etched into memory. They had seen how quickly lies could ignite like dry grass in the harmattan winds, spreading fear and fury until reason was consumed. Yet in the midst of their blindness, truth had risen, stronger than the noise of the crowd, louder than the beat of the drums. From that day forward, the forest no longer carried only whispers of fear. Its edge became a place of reverence, where people walked more carefully, lowering their voices as though the trees themselves might listen. To the children, it was a reminder that unseen eyes were always watching. To the elders, it became a symbol of justice, of divine protection against the corruption of envy and malice. The young woman, once mocked and accused, found her life transformed. Villagers who had turned their faces away in scorn now greeted her with respect, though the weight of their guilt lingered in their eyes. She did not flaunt her vindication, nor did she seek vengeance. Instead, she carried herself with quiet strength, tending to her mother, working the fields, and living as she had always lived, humble and kind. But in her presence, people now saw resilience, a light that could not be dimmed even by the darkest lies. Her story spread beyond the boundaries of the village. Travelers carried it along dusty roads, telling it at firesides in distant lands. It became a warning and a teaching, that envy can rot even the strongest community, and that falsehood, no matter how loud, will one day be unmasked. Mothers whispered her name to their daughters as a symbol of courage, and elders invoked her endurance when guiding the young. The betrayer who had tried to destroy her lived in disgrace, his shame a living punishment. His downfall was a reminder that lies often return to devour their makers. And the council, humbled by their near failure, ruled more carefully in the years that followed, wary of repeating their error. Never again did they allow the crowd's shouts to drown out the search for truth. The envoy eventually departed, his duty fulfilled, but before he left, he spoke quietly to the woman. You may not see the crown upon your head, he told her, but you carry it. Not of gold but of truth and endurance. That is the mark of real greatness. She bowed in gratitude, knowing his words were not for pride but for remembrance. Seasons turned, yet the memory of that night endured. Whenever the sacred drums were beaten in later years, the villagers remembered how once their sound had been silenced by a single voice from the forest. The drums, once only instruments of authority, became symbols of caution, reminding all that judgment must serve truth, not fear. And so, her story became woven into the fabric of the people's lives. A tale told not only to recall shame but to honor the triumph of honesty over deception. It reminded them that while lies may run swiftly, the truth always carries the voice of eternity. For she, the woman they had forced to kneel, did not remain bowed. She rose, unbroken, unshaken, radiant with dignity. And though their hands once dragged her down, destiny itself lifted her higher than any accusation could reach. They forced her to kneel, but destiny made her rise.